Well, welcome, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Hope everyone's managed to find a seat in this very packed house. My name's Penny Matthew. I'm the Freilich Foundation Professor here at the Australian National University. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Ngunnawal land. I acknowledge the first Australians as the traditional custodians of this continent, whose cultures are among the oldest living cultures in human history. I pay respect to the elders of the community and extend my recognition to their descendants who are present today. The Freilich Foundation is very proud to be co-hosting this lecture, Multiculturalism, Success or Failure, together with the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils. You probably know of or have read FECA's National Multicultural Agenda, Different but Equal. We have the Acting Director of FECA, Padma Menon, here today, and I'm also delighted to introduce the Chairperson of FECA, Pino Migliorino, and he will introduce our speaker, Dr. John Hewson. So Pino has over 30 years' involvement with and expertise in immigration and multicultural affairs. He's held a number of important sectoral positions, including Principal Policy Officer at the New South Wales Ethnic Affairs Commission, New South Wales Regional Coordinator, Office of Multicultural Affairs, and Executive Officer, Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales. He has over 2 decades of involvement in community affairs, including welfare, ethnic affairs, the arts, and the Italian community. His personal and professional experience provide him with a unique perspective in the area of communicating and dealing with and understanding ethnic communities in Australia. He's widely published in the multicultural area, has a BA from the University of Sydney, a Diploma of Education from the Sydney Institute of Education, is a qualified practising market researcher and a member of the Public Relations Institute of Australia. So please welcome Pino Migliorino.
And I'd have to say tonight, multiculturalism has been achieved because in the introduction my name was pronounced correctly. Thank you. As Chair of the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia, it is with great pleasure that I'm participating tonight and add our welcome to the one that you've already received. I'd like to start by also acknowledging the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I think it's an interesting thing and a very important thing that organisations such as the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils should always start our framework and our understanding that there was a people in Australia before the waves of migration, including the English in the late 1700s. And I think it's really important, anyone who's seen our document would know that we start by actually acknowledging and recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the first people of Australia. And that's an important principle that we should embark from. Without this acknowledgement, I honestly believe there can be no basis for any cultural equity in Australia. So that's why we feel for it so strongly. I would also like to thank the ANU's Freilich Foundation for co-hosting this event and bringing this important issue to the fore. The Federation is the national peak body in this area, and we provide advocacy, we work on policy, and we promote issues on behalf of our constituencies to government and to the broad community. It is our responsibility to be able to articulate, to be able to define, to be able to argue, and to use evidence as a strong base as to why things like multiculturalism are indeed important for Australia now and into the future. As an organisation, we are given many opportunities to engage with people in the communities, and the Department of Immigration and Citizenship gives us resources to be able to do this, and one of our responsibilities with them is to run a series of national access and equity consultations where we get an opportunity, which is very rare for an advocacy group, to go and actually speak to real people, grassroots people, people who are experiencing lives both as new arrivals, people who've been here for a little bit of time, and those who've been here a longer time. And these consultations have become an extremely important avenue for us. So we're not just advocating or talking on the basis of what we've read in books, but we actually are reflecting real life experiences. And I think that is imbued in what we now do. It has to be real, it has to be evidence driven, and it has to be appropriate to the people we represent and to the environment we want to achieve. We advocate on behalf of our constituents in many other ways, including through our publications and forums, which are often in partnership with key organisations. Most recently, we've been doing a lot of work with the Australian Human Rights Commission, and it's a type of partnership which I think is absolutely essential. What we support is multiculturalism. So this is a very biased approach. Other people might be arguing the toss. You're not going to get an argument for us. It's a defining principle in terms of how we see Australia and why I'm here in front of you as a passionate Australian, but a passionate Australian who does not have English heritage. My heritage is Italian. It makes me no less Australian, and that to me is what multiculturalism is about. Community harmony, social justice, and the rejection of all forms of discrimination and racism. I do want to say that next Monday is the 21st. In Australia, it's become called Harmony Day. It's not for me. It's a day where we recognise the abolition of all forms of racial discrimination. That is what the 21st is in terms of an international calendar. And I think we should always hold true to what the real meaning of that day is. Since we were established in 1979, we've aimed to promote multiculturalism at all levels as a core value which defines us in our own Australianness. Last year, in response to what we believe to be a major vacuum in policy areas and almost a denial of the diversity and the value of diversity in Australia, we spearheaded our own campaign called Reclaim Multiculturalism. We called upon the government to reinstall a multicultural policy which had previously expired in 2006. With the support of many organisations and a very quick call, over 120 key organisations, individuals who really wanted to stand up on this issue, came with us and demonstrated a strong conviction for multiculturalism. The campaign and the work that we did was acknowledged by Chris Bowen as the locus for Australia's new multicultural agenda when he indeed launched 4 weeks ago, almost to the night, the new multicultural policy. And we did smile, and we did feel a little bit of pleasure in the fact that as advocates our words were being not only heard but responded to. And I thank all of you, and many of you in the audience here tonight were part of what we tried to achieve. We congratulate the vision of the government in the release of the people of Australia, Australia's new national multicultural policy. And we brought some copies. And I do think it's interesting because there were comments to me saying, oh, you know, FECA's done enough now, you've actually got a policy, is that enough? I said, well, no. Right now is when our work increases, because now we have to be able to articulate what it actually means. We have to describe it, we have to explain it, we have to engage with it so that we actually have a universal, acceptable meaning for the term so it actually works to unite us, not divide us. And this is where I think that my role here is more valuable than anything else. I want to be able to introduce and acknowledge a valuable contributor to Reclaim Multiculturalism campaign and the advancement of this whole approach, and that is to acknowledge Dr. John Hewson. Dr. John Hewson is an economic and financial expert with experience in academia, business, government, media, the financial system and egg catching, I think, John. Yeah. He was a Member of Parliament for 8 years, 4 of which were as leader of the Liberal Party and the Federal Coalition in opposition for 4 years. Since leaving politics in early 1995, Dr. Hewson has run his own private investment banking business and was, until December in 2004, a member of the Advisory Council of ABN AMRO, having previously been chairman of that bank. In addition, he is chairperson of Osteoporosis Australia and the Arthritis Research Taskforce. And looking around, I think many of us would share, especially I do recently diagnosed with a form of arthritis, and I do thank you for your work in that area. He's also director of a number of other companies, and obviously his reputation precedes him. At present, he is special advisor to the Secretary General of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Hewson also writes an opinion column for the Australian Financial Review and is a panellist on Sky News Agenda program. I'd like to thank you personally, Dr. Hewson, for your contribution and dedication to this issue. We might have potentially differing views on it, but the very fact that you do stand up and speak as an independent and informed voice, it can only be encouraged. In light of his many commitments, I would like to especially thank you for sharing your wisdom tonight on what has been a politically contentious issue in the last couple of weeks. Thank you. Dr. John Hewson.
Well, thank you very much, Pino, for that very generous introduction. And to distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure for me to be here. I've enjoyed very much working with FECA in trying to rekindle public interest in the issue of multiculturalism and in trying to stimulate broad-based debate, and that's really why I've accepted the opportunity to say a few things tonight. I also need to acknowledge a very special person in the audience, my mother-in-law, so I'll be judged very closely, I think, this evening. I just want to start by posing a question. What do you think is the greatest success of Australia as a nation in the post-war period? And if you stop and think about it, there are many categories under which you could ask that question. You could think of sporting achievements, and many individual and team achievements over that period have been outstanding. As a fanatic of St George Rugby League, I'd have to mention the 11 consecutive premierships that they won, and it was a hard choice for me not to choose that, apart from any of the other things that I have. But you go into scientific discoveries, I think, and medical research. I think there's been something like 7 Nobel Prizes. We developed the heart pacemaker. We developed the cochlear implant, I should say. We've developed world-class businesses like BHP. Of course, we've got world-class events like the 56 and the 2000 Olympics. Iconic buildings like the Opera House. In many ways you can cut the pie, and I shouldn't say pie, I'm talking in terms of birthday cakes, but in many ways you can cut that issue and come to a conclusion. But I'd suggest that, to me anyway, the development of our tolerant, multicultural, multiracial society is the greatest achievement of this nation in the post-war period. And it was achieved without a revolution, without bloodshed, without pain, in a relatively short period of time. It clearly paces us, I think, in that area as a world leader. And it's very significant that it was a bipartisan achievement. You don't see too much bipartisanship these days on anything, particularly, I guess, in the current environment of a hung parliament. But it was a bipartisan achievement where both sides of the political spectrum contributed significantly to the development of what we consider today to be our very tolerant, multicultural, multiracial society. I think it's our most valuable national asset. And in those terms, it needs to be managed, it needs to be nurtured, and its weaknesses need to be addressed. To me, it's a continual work in progress, and we should see that for the significance of what it is. I think the facts speak for themselves. Of our population of 22 million today, a quarter were born overseas, and 44% were either born overseas or have one or both parents that were born overseas. Since 1945, there's something like 7 million migrants that have arrived. 4 million speak a language other than English. In total, they speak some 260 languages and identify with some 270 ancestries. In essence, what we see in our multicultural society today is ethnic and cultural diversity that is an asset, it's not a problem, and that is not divisive. It's a source of economic and social wealth and dynamism. The focus is on interaction, not isolation. It's on complementarity rather than competitiveness, and all within a framework of shared principles and values, including loyalty to Australia, freedom of speech and religion, English as our national language, equality of opportunity, no non-discrimination, whether by race, sex or sexuality, and subject to our constitution, the rule of law, and our parliamentary democracy and related processes. It's a shared responsibility to value, develop and nurture this asset. The benefits are unquestioned in terms of innovation, ideas, skills, energy and achievement, all of which have enriched our lives and allowed us to enjoy a higher standard of living and given us much better understanding of our position in our region and our position in the world. In general, migrants come to Australia for a better life and the general opportunities for themselves and their families. As various migrant groups have arrived on our shores, they've established churches, community groups, welfare associations, schools, sporting clubs, aged care facilities, etc., that are important to the preservation and development of their heritage and their inheritance, but not to cut themselves off from the broader Australian community. In doing so, they have been afforded and given respect. In time, each generation has tended to broaden beyond their community and their initial location, with employment, sport and cultural activities, development of language skills, and even quirks of the broader Australian character, marriage and so on. The sustained strength of our economy has generally facilitated this process, minimising the risks of racism and communal discord. Of course, there have been a lot of tensions along the way. For example, each migrant group has tended to want to close the door on the next one. At times, tolerance has been tested as a result of actions by some of our political leaders and by various developments. And there's a host of these, I'll just name a few. Howard's anti-immigration remarks in the mid-1980s, for example, the rise of Hansonism, and its encouragement, I thought, which was a travesty, by the Howard government in a naive attempt to consolidate a hardline right political constituency which they hoped would be reflected in their votes at the next election. As I warned at the time, it would probably result in another party that would take the votes anyway, which is in fact what indeed happened. There have been recent remarks attributed to, by way of a leak from Shadow Cabinet, threatening to focus a political campaign against Muslims. As meaningless as that would be, given that Muslims account for about 1.17%, I think, of the Australian population. We've also seen the politicisation of multiculturalism. It went through a period of great difficulty in this respect, where it became a blanket cover, really, for attempts at vote buying in very basic terms, allocation of largesse, the abuse of the family reunion opportunities and so on are a good example of that. We've also had the Cronulla riots, we've had attacks against Indian students, we've had some evidence of activities of triads and other ethnic gangs, had evidence of abuse of pension and other welfare entitlements, whereby immigrants only stay long enough to qualify and then go back to their home country. We've had controversial local council decisions concerning the construction of mosques and Islamic schools and other ethnic-related activities. We've had the increased arrival in recent days, of course, of boat people, a subject to which I will return to in a moment. So I think that, we've been very successful despite those sort of challenges, and there have been many, many more of those challenges by way of events, by way of statements, by political leaders and so on, that have caused people, I think, to question the pace at which we were developing our multicultural society and the success that we were having with it. I think it's worth me just spending a couple of minutes looking back at the history of the development of our multicultural society, give you my reflections anyway on that process, which, as I said, was essentially a bipartisan process, often perhaps not by design, but certainly by outcome of success. Our nation was founded, of course, on the White Australia policy, with the Barton government's Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. We should never forget that. That entrenched racism, it entrenched xenophobia in our entire political system. With the post-war programs to expand immigration, the focus was on British migrants, and where the numbers there fell short, the top-up was some selected Europeans who at the time was thought would assimilate into our society. Asians and Jews were severely restricted, surprisingly, in that context. Arthur Call was the champion of the post-war immigration scheme in the Chifley government, and he was famous for a lot of things, but he was famous for so many quips that summarised his attitude to immigration, and I think more broadly multiculturalism. He propagated the idea populate or perish. He coined the term New Australians to get away from pommy bastards and other expressions that people were using. And of course he had that famous expression, two wrongs don't make a white, which summarised his position, and actually a position he held well into the 1970s. In the late 50s and 60s, the Brits and selected Europeans dried up and circumstances in Europe recovered, and many more wanted to stay at home rather than migrate to Australia. And at a time where our ties with Asia were developing rapidly, pressure mounted to end our racist immigration policy. We did some things well during that period. Nevertheless, we started the Colombo Plan, where we brought hundreds of Asian students to Australian universities. And I know in my own experience, dealing with senior officials throughout the region, just how many of those have actually come out of that Colombo Plan experience and now hold very senior positions in their economies and in their societies. We also saw some movement in thinking and policy away from assimilation towards the concept of integration and the early stages of the recognition of a multicultural society, and this is in the late 50s and early 60s. The breakdown of the White Australia policy was truly a bipartisan exercise. It started with the Holt government in signing the UN Convention to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination in 1966. They signed it, but not too much was enacted by them beyond that. And they opened, nevertheless, they did, in immigration terms, open the door to selected non-European immigration. And then, of course, in 1973, the Whitlam government passed the Australian Citizenship Act, and in 75 they passed the very important Racial Discrimination Act, which gave expression, I guess, to the UN convention that was signed by the Holt government. So significantly, a bipartisan process. And then, of course, we shouldn't forget that the Holt government also put the 67 referendum to ensure a degree, and I'll use these words carefully, a degree of equality for Aboriginal people. It was an interesting referendum in the history of referenda in Australia, because the concept of referenda were to make it very difficult to ever pass anything. That was the element that is entrenched by our founding fathers, having to get a majority of the people in a majority of the states. Well, that referenda got over 90% of the people in all 6 states, which I think is as it should have been, but nevertheless, given the history of referenda in this country, an outstanding result. Multicultural policies, though, really only started in the 70s with the work of Al Grasby and Malcolm Fraser. Grasby gave a speech, a very key speech, back in 73, which was regarded as the first official exposition of a policy for promoting a multicultural Australia, including permitting ethnic groups, and I quote, to create their own commercial life and preserve their cultural heritage indefinitely while taking part in the general life of the nation. And he expressed as the family of the nation. However, due to economic circumstances, this enlightened approach to immigration was crunched because they cut dramatically coupling immigration in the same year due to very difficult economic circumstances in 73. And then, of course, Fraser institutionalised, I'd say, multiculturalism. You can go back and look at many speeches and many events that Malcolm Fraser originated and participated in that clearly established his very strong support for multiculturalism. I know that to be a fact because I was around working in his government from 76 to 83. One of his key advisors at the time was Petro Georgiou, who subsequently became my Chief of Staff when I was in Parliament as Leader of the Opposition. And Petro drove that in the Fraser government and the Fraser office. I see today so many times, and I just did a press interview, they said, "You're sounding very much like Malcolm Fraser. Have you changed your mind too? Have you rejuvenated?" If you go back and read Malcolm Fraser in the 70s and early 80s, you'll find that he's pretty much the same as Malcolm Fraser today. It just doesn't suit people to treat him as if he's consistent. They suggest that he's changed his mind just to take a shot at John Howard or Tony Abbott or whatever. But I think if you go back, he really did, in my summary, institutionalise multiculturalism in the 70s and early 80s. Support for multiculturalism has sort of come and gone since the early 1980s, with the last specific policy, I should say, which expired in 2006, except 4 weeks ago the government recommitted, and probably in response to Pino's just, dogged determination biting at their heels, that they've got to re-establish a multicultural policy, but it is having a wider effect. I mean, they made a commitment to a new Australian Multicultural Council, although they haven't explained how it relates to the current one, and they're going to establish a national anti-racism partnership and strategy. All very good things. They're going to improve access and equality of opportunity. All good things, all good words. We need to see the detail carried through of those broad-based commitments. The principles are fine, the words are good. Let's see the detail now carried through. And this is why I think it is so important that we have occasions like this, and there are many contributions to the debate going forward, because there are a multiplicity of views on many of these issues. I thought it might be useful, against having commented briefly on the history, to just give you some personal reflections from my own life about my multicultural experiences, because I feel that I've lived this multicultural experience that I've just described. I went to a primary school in the southern suburbs of Sydney that was almost, at the time, 100% white Anglo. Could have been Saxon, could have been Celtic, I'm not sure. Definitely, probably Protestant. I went back there a few years ago, and it was about 95% mixture of some 28 other nationalities. The transformation in the short space of my lifetime, from primary school to now, was quite staggering. When I was 10 years old, we moved from the Carlton area, it was in George area, to Beverly Hills, and our house was located between two migrant hostel settlements, migrant hostel settlements, one in Herne Bay and one in Beverly Hills. That was subsequently torn down and made into a girls' school. The Herne Bay one, with some American money, was turned into low-cost housing and is little better than a slum these days, unfortunately. But I have very vivid memories from my childhood of growing up in that sort of environment. These were basically huts, in Herne Bay in particular. They housed sort of up to 3 newly arrived migrant families in each, only as temporary accommodation while they completed their paperwork and found somewhere else to live and so on. It was sort of the last days of the sponsored immigration program from the UK. There was a heavy concentration of Brits, but other European nationalities, and as we used to call them in our days, White Russians. They were of the Eastern European Baltic states in particular. These were difficult and uncertain times for these people, but mostly they had come for a better life and they were determined to make a start. That's what I remember distinctly. And some have been incredibly successful in the years since, from that very sort of rudimentary beginning. This was largely their first contact with Australians and the Australian way of life. They developed relationships with the local community through schools and churches and shopping and playing with kids like us. And it wasn't long before they found themselves an occupation. And as I said before, the economy's strength was important because if there hadn't been jobs to go to and the social and cultural pressures that would have flowed from that would have been very significant. During these years, I read Nino Culotto's story, an Italian immigrant who migrates to Australia as a journalist, writing for an Italian publishing house about Australians and their way of life, for those Australians who might want to come to Australia, who might want to migrate to Australia. Nino works as a brickies labourer in order to get to learn about real Australians. The book focuses on his attempts to understand English as spoken by working class Australians in the 50s and 60s, as Nino had previously learned good English, as he described it, from a textbook. He marries Kay, who he met in a Manly cafe, by attempting to teach her that he cannot eat spaghetti with a spoon. It's a comic novel written by John O'Grady under the pseudonym of Nino. It has a simple message that immigrants should count themselves lucky and should make efforts to assimilate into Australia, including learning to speak English. Now, this book was written as a bet with his brother. It was first published in '57, had an initial print run of 6,000 copies. In less than 6 months, it had been reprinted 8 times and sold 74,000 copies, and had sold 130,000 copies in its first year. By the time of John O'Grady's death in '81, the book, They're a Weird Mob, had been reprinted 47 times and sold nearly 1 million copies. So I think it was interesting that there was a voracious interest in reading, even though it was comic humour and satirical in most of it, and probably poor literature to most people. It actually did summarise the mood. And I labour the point, though, because I think one of the essentials of our successful multicultural society has been our ability to laugh at each other and with each other. It's been an important element of the success of that society. And wherever I've been in the world, they've always been the equivalent of the Irish joke, the Italian joke, and equally they have many so-called Australian jokes. I also met Nino in my later life, an Italian mate of mine called Louie, who is today one of my best friends. He still struggles with English, even having been here for some 60 years. We met as joint centre forwards in a district soccer team, and I soon realised that my job was to prevent him from killing the referee in the first 10 minutes of every game. I must say I also improved my language skills in relation to Italian. At least I could produce the longest list of the best Italian swear words in the world. Temper was an outstanding feature of Louie, and we had an enjoyable time together and still do. He arrived in Australia as a newly trained auto mechanic who followed his brother here, who'd come for the Snowy Hydro scheme. They then built a very successful auto business, worked very hard, married Australian girls, both of them, worked hard to raise and educate their kids. Those kids married non-Italians, and they produced several grandchildren. Louie has nevertheless never lost his Italian roots. I've been back several times with him to his village in Cividale, where he supported a childcare centre which had particular significance to his son, who died tragically several years ago. I've also been subjected to endless Italian meals and sing-songs and also a mia, and to me he's a quintessential role model of a successful Italian immigrant, and he would be one of the proudest Australians you will ever meet. In my postgraduate study years, I was exposed to a couple of competitive multicultural societies that have helped me appreciate what we have created here in Australia. First, I experienced Canada. Now, Canada is often put up as an example of another very successful multicultural society. I don't think it's anywhere near as successful as ours, but in that experience, as a student and teacher there, I got to understand the Indian problem, as it was called, and the Polish immigration problem, and the transition. I was there at the transition. The time they were making a transition to be a bilingual nation. They forced everything to be printed in both English and French. And in fact, I had a very good friend at university who had to pass a French language test for his degree. He'd been graduated for 5 years, still couldn't pass the French test. It put enormous strains on the development of their multicultural society. Canada is a country where successive governments have supported multiculturalism, but with less success due to language issues and the continuing debate about the true nation's composition, whether Quebec is going to succeed and so on. It has been easier in Australia with respect to one national language, the acceptance of one national language, English, and a very strong support for learning it. Second, I spent 6 years in the Baltimore, Washington area, arriving in Baltimore in 1969 following the Black Riots in '68. These were riots which followed the assassination of Martin Luther King and resulted in a very significant percentage of the city of Baltimore being burnt to the ground. It got an enormous amount of publicity at the time because Governor Spiro Agnew, you might remember him, he made an ungracious exit from the position of Vice President somewhat later in his life, but at the time he was Governor of Maryland. He marshalled the troops he called in the National Guard. At the time I was there, a few months after that, the student ghetto in which we lived had joined the black ghetto. It was just separated by a cyclone wire fence. Here I got to understand racism. By living in particularly racist communities like that, I came to strongly support the movement for civil rights. I came to work in Washington as part of my time, which was at the time nearly 85% black. I lived with black people. I remember jogging daily with a black man. His name was Ford. Both first name and second name, it was Ford. And he said to me, "You don't want to run with me because they turn the dogs on me." And they did turn the dogs on him until they saw that I was white. And they stopped. And that is a very basic level example of how racism manifests itself on a daily basis in the lives of some of these people. Finally, in my professional career, I've worked with many migrant groups and for many purposes, from sport to aged care. Also spent several weeks as a politician, travelling mostly without the media to sit down with many Aboriginal communities, from Eddie Marbo's home in the Torres Strait, through the Torres Strait, down the Cape, across the Gulf, throughout northern Western Australia. I wanted to understand firsthand from a multiplicity of Aboriginal communities their attachment to the land, their concept of native title, because I had the view, having been to Eddie's home, that he would win that. He was dead, but they would win that case. Because when you go to the Torres Strait and you say, "Where's Eddie's land?" they say, "It goes from here to that tree, that rock." They had a land tenure system which was going to stand the test of our court system, in my view. And so I wanted to be prepared for the debate about native title. But similarly, when there was a debate about the mining of Coronation Hill, and the Jawoyn people were at issue, and Bob Hawke was saying that none of them wanted it, I flew in there in a very dangerous flight to satisfy myself that 84 of the 85% Jawoyn people that lived there actually wanted it desperately as a basis of employment and the development of their community. In my seat I had Aboriginal issues. In part I thought I had the smallest and wealthiest seat in Australia, but I did also have a significant Aboriginal component in Redfern, including perhaps the block that you may remember, and I visited many regional centres. One particular experience I had, which I'll finish with, was I was asked by Dave Hill of Soccer Australia to become chairman of Sydney United as part of a broader strategy to reduce the ethnicity of soccer, which good luck. Indeed, my challenge was to, in his words and their words, mainstream the team. They're a Croatian team. I had some success for a time, although the Croatian community ultimately regained control of the team and was soon thrown out of the league through a number of ethnic-related incidents at various games, for which they became quite famous. I nevertheless forget the reluctant support I had when I was given this task to mainstream the team. I called the first board meeting, I called everybody in, and I said, now, you guys serious about this? Do you really want to, we can move to Parramatta Park rather than to Denver Park, we can change our sponsors, we can do all these sorts of things, but are you really serious about wanting to mainstream the team? And they said, yeah, what do you mean? I said, can I play the first Serb as centre forward? That sorted them out pretty quickly. They of course said yes, but made every effort to ensure that I didn't. In recent months we've seen a couple of strong statements by Angela Merkel of Germany and David Cameron of the UK to the effect that multiculturalism has failed in their countries. However, by our standards, neither of those countries has actually had a multicultural policy. And this largely accounts for the ethnic tensions about which they are now very, very concerned. For Merkel, the issue is essentially guest workers, which Germany has been happy to attract and use, but has made virtually no attempt to include them in any meaningful way in the broader German community, nor to appreciate them or their culture beyond recognising their economic contribution to the German economy. As Chris Bowen has recently described it, significant communities living parallel lives. That is a very good description of what has happened in Germany. While our post-war immigration was also originally driven, by economic imperatives, the Germans have failed to recognise what we have in Australia. Namely, and I quote, the societal benefits of inviting full community participation by our immigrant populations in return for respect for and embracing of the cultures and customs that have been transported here by that immigration. By comparison, David Cameron's recent remarks were more in the context of homegrown terrorists and his concern about homegrown terrorists. He admits to a failure to develop a strong national identity, and he calls for, and I quote, a more active muscular liberalism, where equal rights, the rule of law, freedom of speech and democracy are actively promoted to create a stronger national identity. He urged that it is time to turn the page on failed policies of the past, policies in fact which they didn't have. He basically is advocating now what we enjoy as fundamental to our multicultural society. He has said, and I quote this, I believe a genuinely liberal country believes in certain values and actively supports them. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, democracy, the rule of law, equal rights regardless of race, sex or sexuality. It says to its citizens, this is what defines us as a society. To belong here is to believe in these things. It's a fair description of what we've been working on and developing for the entire post-war period. We can also see similar failures of so-called multicultural policies in France, which has faced significant ethnic tensions, strikes, riots and so on from time to time. Failure to include risks separatism, resentment and potentially violence. Now, I said in my opening remarks that multiculturalism in Australia is a work in progress. I said it's dynamic. I said, but as a work in progress, it needs constant management and constant nurturing. It's not something that you just fix once and then just move on. And this is one thing that I think this debate now, as the government is moving to a new multicultural policy, it's very important to expand their range of thinking about what is required. There are several immediate challenges, especially now that the Gillard government has committed to a new multicultural policy, including, and I quote, a strengthening of the access and equity framework, a reprioritising of the scope of the diversity and social cohesion program to include funding for multicultural arts and festivals, small grants, and the establishment of a multicultural youth sports partnership program. Again, great words. Let's see the substance in due course. They're all very sensible and they're all very welcome initiatives. But I would list these as, excuse me, I think, however, in saying that, the government's ignoring certain bigger challenges, and I would list these. I mean, I'm not going to list them all. I'll just pick 4 that I think are there today in the development of our multicultural policy. The need to further develop our national identity, the mounting risk of tribalism, the continuing failure to make significant progress in eliminating Aboriginal disadvantage, and the mounting inhumanity in the treatment of boat people. There's too much in all these for me to adequately deal with them in this brief lecture. For example, an important element of the further development of our national identity would be how to rekindle the Republican debate, but I haven't got enough time to go into that. So let me take a somewhat different tack and suggest that we should be embarrassed as a nation that our original inhabitants, to which we have all been added as migrants or descendants thereof, that these people remain in such economic, social and personal disadvantage, both in absolute terms and relative to almost all migrants that have arrived since the Second World War and the broader Australian community. Now, I'm conscious of being in this theatre, the Sir Roland Wilson building, and the role that Sir Roland Wilson played with his book, Bringing Them Home, the report on the stolen generation. I'm very conscious of that, but I have to say the sorry statement was long overdue and fundamental to real progress in this area, but it is largely worthless unless it results in a significant and sustained reduction in disadvantage in the near term and in the elimination of that disadvantage very shortly thereafter. I'm sure both sides of politics would claim to be working on it. You know, there'd be the quote, we're working on it, we have the solutions, but that is not good enough for a country in our position, in the circumstances in which we find ourselves today, and it's not good enough if we want to boast about being a truly multicultural society. When the government and the opposition make those sort of statements like we're working on it, we have solutions, where is the priority and where is the urgency? In a similar vein, we should also be increasingly embarrassed as a nation that our emphasis, a nation that emphasises its multicultural credentials, that we have accepted the substantial erosion in the application of the rule of law. We require our new citizens to sign up to the rule of law in their citizenship pledge, a pledge to uphold and obey our laws. Yet both sides of Parliament have recently been participating in a process to erode these laws. I have a good friend, Greg Barnes, who I spoke with on Monday night at the Wheeler Centre. He's a barrister from Tasmania, has taken a number of these calls, ex-head of the Republican movement. I'm not going to raise that issue, I said that. But he was speaking, and he made a very strong point that, and to quote him, adherence to the rule of law makes a difference between good and bad government. And I think it's a Tom Biggin quote that he's reshuffled, but it is a very significant assessment of the significance of the rule of law. I put it to you that the treatment of asylum seekers is a case in point of the abandonment of the rule of law, as both major parties have sold out to populism and participated in this unseemly race to the bottom. Amazingly, for example, you can go back to the Howard government's Tampa laws, which amazingly at the time the ALP supported, back in 2001, through to the low point of the last election where the contest was who was best able to stop the boats. We have to summarise, and I use a number of the points raised by Greg Barnes to list this, but we've created a regime of mandatory detention of asylum seekers, including women and children. We've excised areas off the mainland of this continent, creating a legal no man's land. We've restricted the rights of desperate and the desperate and mostly impecunious individuals to access to court. We've empowered our security agencies to behave in the most authoritarian way, making adverse security rulings against asylum seekers but not telling them why such a ruling has been made. We've passed people smuggling laws which impose mandatory jail terms and destruction of property, irrespective of the personal circumstances of the individuals involved. More broadly, in the anti-terror area and the laws relating to that, we have permitted surveillance and control on the liberty of individuals without trial through control orders. We've created thought crime, where individuals are sent to prison for doing no more than talking and writing. We've allowed detention without access to legal advice, and we're sat on our hands where people like David Hicks were tortured by the Americans. Our political leaders have carefully created, fanned and exploited fear to the point that the presumption of innocence is easily sacrificed, where terrorism arrests are greeted as having stymied terrorist attacks well before any trial where the prosecution would have to prove its case. The political process is obsessed with this concept of security, which they've undoubtedly picked up from a series of focus group assessments or research on both sides. It convinces them that people are fearful, and this is despite crime rates having been generally reduced and there being no widespread evidence of widespread terror networks in Australia. I've just given you a very significant and substantial list of examples of where we've undermined or abandoned the rule of law. So much so that a few thousand asylum seekers arriving by boats are to be feared, even though they are only a small percentage of those who actually arrive by plane and just simply overstay their visa. And they're a very small percentage in terms of the number of people who we actually take in an immigration program, in recent years been as high as 250 to 300,000. It's time for a complete rethink of our asylum seeker strategy. A good start would be to recognise its inhumanity and the extent and significance of the erosion of the rule of law. We ask these people when they come here who want to be citizens to sign up to the rule of law, and then we progressively undermine it. And we get away with it in the political process by creating the concept of fear, frightening people and driving them to particular conclusions. The problem we got is that to deal with this issue calls for leadership. It's leadership that is prepared to take political risks, even a risk as basic as seeking to educate rather than scare the Australian people. Unfortunately, I've got to say, with a hung parliament and our current stock of politicians, who see politics as little more than a game, a contest to say or do whatever is required to win the daily media cycle, we will probably drown in spin before we see any policy substance in this particular area. The tragedy is that as part of our multicultural society, we have had an excellent record of humanitarian resettlement of refugees. There are proposals running around today as to how we can help with the Japanese refugees until that economy can be rebuilt. The last 10 years in this country have worked significantly to destroy that record of humanitarian settlement. To conclude, I just want to say one thing. I could not say it any better than Dr. Martin Luther King, who in a letter from jail in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hewson, for a very stimulating talk. John's kindly volunteered to take questions for perhaps the next 10 minutes. So I'd like now to open the floor to the audience to ask what you will. Yes, over there.
You've talked about how the achievements of Australia's multicultural society were bipartisan achievements in the post-war period. Do you have any thoughts on how we can move back towards bipartisan appreciation of the importance of multiculturalism, particularly when the Liberal Party seems so focused on using it as a political issue?
Look, we've heard on a number of occasions how we should have bipartisan support on big issues. You would think that climate change, which I do think is the largest moral, economic, social and political challenge of this century, which I think somebody named Kevin Rudd once said, I think that if that is true, and the significance of that and the transcends the significance of any of the individuals presently involved, and the solutions will outlive their lifetime, you'd imagine in those circumstances you might hope to get some level of bipartisan support. I actually proposed this multicultural framework as a way of trying to look at the issue of how to put a price on carbon. I was staggered that the opposition didn't choose to be part of that. They say they have a direct action plan. Well, I'm an economist, I can tell you, from my side of the fence, there is an implicit price on carbon in that direct action plan. And I'd be amazed if it is not substantially higher than anything Julia Gillard will announce in the next 3 to 5 years, by whatever mechanism they determine it. So they have, on a credibility basis, no argument for not being there. And they're not there. So you would think in that case that, that you would get some level of bipartisanship. So when I come to issues like multicultural, they may, because there may be voting patterns in certain ethnic communities that they are particularly worried about. But beyond that, I don't think you will see. You will see it because, as I said, politics today, unfortunately, has become a game. Played out in 24-hour cycles, media cycles. In fact, there are cycles within cycles now, because if you watch Sky News, breaking news, somebody said something and somebody else said something and somebody else said something, so it's who's winning that cycle. But all that is spin and no substance. And even the government, I better share my criticism around, even the government, Julia Gillard says before the election no carbon tax, having supported a carbon tax and an ETS determination all the way through the Garner report, the Green Paper, the White Paper, the legislation, negotiation with the... Okay, then she tells Rudd to back off. She tells him not to go for double dissolution. She then uses it to unseat him as Prime Minister. She says before the election no carbon tax. And now she immediately announces the fact that she will have a price on carbon which has been sold quickly by everyone else as a carbon tax. And she can't say, oh, well, I changed my mind. She goes out trying to explain it away, like when you're driving home and you get blocked, you change your route. And explanations like that she gave in Q&A. Or she even invoked John Howard and the way he sold the GST as an example of why she's doing what she's doing. Fact is, we're not even getting honesty in that level of the debate. I'm not sure how we're going to get much honesty when it gets to the actual point of putting a price on carbon and somebody working out what impact it actually has, rather than what Tony Abbott says it has. I think, though, this area we need, and that's where FECA has a role, to try and build a constituency of bipartisan support. And I would be working the individual members of Parliament to build that constituency, not relying so much on the leaders. You've got a good man in Chris Bowen as Minister. He's a trained economist, so he looks at it from an economic point of view, but he would hate me saying that. But I think that you have a chance to build a constituency, but it's long, hard yards to get all those backbenchers on side and then be prepared to stand up in their caucus or cabinet meeting and start to argue that we should be doing something different. So I think it was accidental bipartisanship in the past. If they'd focused on that, they probably wouldn't have agreed even then.
Okay, we've got at least 3 more questions. One right up the back, over here and down here.
My question is to do with universal human rights and multiculturalism. FECA, in its different but equal document, has controversially backed away from universal commitment to human rights and seems to have embraced a form of cultural relativism. Do you think that multiculturalism is compatible with universal human rights and that all societies should embrace something like the UN's International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights?
Yeah, look, I think I mentioned in my remarks the fact that the whole government actually signed that UN anti-discrimination, anti-racial discrimination convention back in 1966, and there have been many of them since. And there has been, I think, a bit of a backlash about whether in fact we should allow the determination of some of these to go outside the country, where you have the capacity as a group within a country to appeal outside a country to try and push a country to do what is right. Now, having said that, I don't necessarily support that. I would rather see the debate turn slightly differently. I'd rather have a proper debate about a Human Rights Act in this country first. Now, Rudd knocked that back just before his demise, but I don't think that we should be, we ought to be mature enough to be able to debate an issue like that. Then when you get a level of debate and understanding at that level, I think you can realistically think in terms of international human rights. I mean, one of the troubles with human rights is it's one of those things you know when they're being breached. You know, in Libya today we know they're being breached. With asylum seekers and what's happening in Christmas Island, I know they're being breached. You may not, I believe they are. There's a lot of human rights issues that just get washed away and washed under the carpet. I think a debate about a Human Rights Act, and you know, you can have the people go, oh no, we can't have a Bill of Rights and all this sort of stuff, but quite frankly, we need to have that debate. We're at the stage in the development of a multicultural society where we have to be mature enough to have that debate. And it will be a hard one if it gets politicised and there's no bipartisan support for any element of it. You know, it's just so much easier to say no. And Tony Abbott, as I said when I introduced him last year at a conference, he's the best leader of the opposition ever because he's a master of the negative. He's a master of saying no. And he says it very easily. And he doesn't even think about it before he says it. So you're going to have a problem.
Some more questions, and maybe someone from FECA would also like to jump in on that particular question, perhaps after we've taken a few more for John, because I think the paper's actually a very nuanced one. It might be good to tease out.
Oh, I don't agree with the comment, but
I think that FECA would take the view that you've actually managed to mediate that debate between universality and cultural relativity.
Just to pick up, there's a couple of points, and I think John pointed out correctly. We make a major distinction between how we treat people in Australia and how we treat people who aren't in Australia. The whole treatment of asylum seekers is based on this notion that once you're a resident, you have different rights than when you're not. And I think it's a fundamental issue. I mean, I'd have to actually see exactly where in our policy. That's certainly not, but it's not an argument of cultural relativism. In fact, if we're going to go to the next part of the debate, I think the next part of the debate is a really interesting one, because if you heard Chris Boland's speech, it was very much about people coming here and accepting things as they are. And I think that's, if you like, the start of the debate, because for me, things have changed because of who's here. So this notion that they stay static is, to some extent, a nonsense. And so I'm going to look forward to how we actually change those things so that they are adaptive and conducive to accommodating a multicultural society. So am I arguing cultural relativism only? No, I'm not. I'm not, and I don't think FECA is. Are there issues to do with the ascendancy of certain cultural norms and the way they're being expressed? Yes, if we take that things like the rule of law, equality between the sexes, you know, on and on, are only Australian or Western values, and I'd argue that they're not. I'd argue that they're not. And in fact, that they're core principles in most of the philosophical, academic traditions and cultural traditions across the world. I think they're universal. So I'm not arguing cultural relevance.
What do you do about Sharia law, where it's applicable in the financial sector relatively easily, and it's abhorrent in other aspects of its implementation? So what do you do?
Well, I think that's where we test our systems, and we try to argue them and create positions around more principled responses. It is too easy to argue the benefit of economy at the expense of the rights of individuals. And I think that's where our social debates need to be. So the overall needs to be defined.
It's coming that debate, isn't it?
Okay, there are a couple more. Yes.
Do you think that Tony Abbott's failure to censure remarks made by Scott Morrison and Corey Bernardi amounts to a tacit approval of them?
Look, I don't think that Scott Morrison made those remarks. You're talking about the Muslim remarks or the funeral remarks? The funeral remarks, he just got his timing wrong. I mean, it's fine. It's fine to actually inquire as to the cost of these things in a Senate hearing where you're looking at costs and so on, but not on the day of the funeral. And you know, I think that was just absolutely appalling judgment, and he immediately apologised for that. He claims not to have said what was attributed to him in relation to Muslims. Having said so, I don't know, but I can go back to an example where there is a similar nuance. When Pauline Hanson made her maiden speech in the Parliament, which many people thought was either racist or pretty damn close to it in certain parts. What annoyed me was the fact that John Howard didn't say anything for a few days deliberately, and I said this at the time, and then he finally came out and said, well, of course you've got to recognise that the people in Australia that have these sort of views, which is code for nod, nod, wink, wink, go for it, to the hardline right who want to run on racist issues and the racist dimension of policies. And I know internally in the Liberal Party they said, hey, this is terrific, it'll consolidate a hardline right vote and it'll come to us at the next election. And I said, you bloody fools, because if that vote is substantial, it will coalesce around a party, and you won't get those votes and you won't get those preferences necessarily at the next election. So that's the sort of statement that gets made that really is appalling. And Gillard's been guilty of it in recent days as well. And in the sort of media cycle we've got, they can say these things, they can get them into the ether, and they don't actually get held accountable for them down the track, which they should be.
I'm actually two questions, one for short term and one for long term. Let's start with the short term. We have a department, federal department, look after multicultural affairs, even shy to talk about the Department of Multicultural Affairs. Recently, we just named the Parliamentary Secretary to be Multicultural Affairs and so on. I think during your time, served in the Fraser government and subsequently as oppositions, during the Fraser and the whole Keating government, the Office of Multicultural Affairs is part of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. That's a very important policy. Therefore, I seek your comment on the long-term questions, which is more fundamental. As you point out in your earlier presentations, Australia, our founding fathers, basically is providing the white straight policy. As a result of that, it's enshrined in our constitutions. Now, isn't it, it's about time, with all the other things going on, as the Republican movement, and as well as the recognitions of our first Australian, multiculturalism should be part of that renewal of our constitution. Please comment.
Yeah, look, I think in terms of the longer term issue, that is true. I've said for a long time we should have an independent review and a related public debate on the Constitution. The Constitution really is a dated document in so many respects. And there's so many aspects of our Westminster system of Parliament and beyond that doesn't get mentioned in the Constitution. So a lot have happened by regulation and decree and so on over the years. But I think we need the Constitution to be a living, breathing document. The Founding Fathers designed it with a mechanism which made it difficult, if not impossible, to change. And so there have been very few referendum questions that have got up in the history of our nation since 1901. In terms of where they put the department, I've always thought that on some of these really sensitive issues, it's much easier to attach them to the Prime Minister as a practical matter within government. And I wonder what negative signals they're sending when they don't do that. And in fact, they didn't even attach it directly to Chris Bowen, they attached it to his parliamentary secretary. And so you're a couple of layers down in terms of the pecking order. I guess, they moved quickly and they had to decide what to do. But I would think it's just like the debate used to be about the Office of the Status of Women, or whatever way it was described, had various titles. But it tended to be attached to the Prime Minister. And it tended to be an easier place to put it, to ensure that it got the status and the attention that it deserves. The thing that worries me about a multicultural society, if I'm right, if it's our single greatest national asset and it's the greatest success in the post-war period, it ought to be front and centre in everything we do. And to downgrade it, I think, is a mistake.